Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com, to another blog and to another podcast. Welcome to those who access the podcast through Rumble, YouTube, and Spotify. Today we continue our study in the book of Romans. We're in chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, which reads, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." That's Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. Today we return to our study of Romans 13, which is a part of the overall final section in Romans. While Romans 1 through 3 is about the sinful condition of man, and Romans 4 and 5 is about salvation, Romans 6 through 8 is about sanctification, and Romans 9 through 11 is about the sovereignty of God. And finally, Romans chapters 12 through 16 is about service, or being a servant of God. In verse 8 of today's passage we read, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law." The Apostle Paul used the word love 5 times in these verses. When we feed the flesh, we limit love. When we feed the Spirit, we allow love to run wildly in our midst. The love that the Apostle Paul wrote about here is agape, or unconditional love. Used 320 times in the New Testament, agape is the type of love that is selfless and self-sacrificing. And when we love like this, we are getting to the essence for which God gave us the commandments in the first place, that love might abound among us. When Paul says, "Owe no man anything," he is not forbidding us from taking out a loan to purchase something. To owe no man anything is a bridge from verses 6 through 7, where the apostle had addressed the paying of our taxes, which we owe the government. Paying our taxes is a debt. The Apostle Paul bridges from there to the point about love by simply saying, "Owe no man anything but love." In other words, pay all of your debts. And the one debt we will always pay and never really have paid is the debt of love. We have all owed money to people. And when we are around them, the first thing that comes into our mind is the money we owe them. And we find it difficult to turn off that thought. In fact, we wonder to ourselves, is he thinking of the money I owe him? This is the way we ought to be about love. We should remember that we have an obligation to love everyone. Such is the nature of the heart that has been impacted by the mercy and grace of God. God's mercy reminds us that we are not getting what we deserve, and His grace reminds us that we're getting what we do not deserve. In verse 9 of today's passage we read, "For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." In this one verse, the Apostle Paul isolates the 7th, the 6th, the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th commandments, in that order. Perhaps he mentions the 7th first because there was a particular problem with the 7th in the church at Rome. You will note that the 10 Commandments consist of 2 divisions. The first 4 have to do with our relationship with God, and the second Commands 5 through 10 have to do with our interactions with other people. The only commandment of the ones related to our dealings with people that is left out here is the 5th commandment. Honor your father and mother. The point that Paul is making is if we live by the law of love, we will fulfill the law of Moses. In verse 10 of today's passage, we read, "Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." In the Old Testament, there were 10 commandments, and then the Lord Jesus comes along and turns them from negatives into positives when he reduced them from 10 to 2. Instead of a bunch of thou shalt nots, he said, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And when we are busy loving someone, there will be no danger of us longing for their spouse, murdering them, stealing from them, bearing false witness about them, or coveting what they have. It is important not to confuse the order of these 2 great commands. People often get this backward and live as though the law is the fulfillment of love. The trouble is that when the law is the fulfillment of love, we may try to learn what love is by examining the law. Christians start assuming that the rules they follow are inherently loving in every context. The Pharisees made this mistake when they assumed that it was the law that made them righteous. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, they questioned the Lord Jesus about his disciples picking and eating grain on the Sabbath, which was unlawful. The Lord Jesus pointed out that David and his men broke the law by eating the consecrated bread, and even the priests break the law on the Sabbath to perform their duties. The law, in and of itself, doesn't make a person holy, nor does breaking the law necessarily make one unholy. When we place love as the fulfillment of the law, we can use it as a measure of the law. Paul says that loving others fulfills the law, that all commands are summed up in loving our neighbors as ourselves, and that love is the fulfillment of the law because it doesn't harm others. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast is helping you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.